Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, and we're up to Symphony number 42. And this, I think, is a significant symphony in several respects. And for that reason, I want to use it as a moment to take stock, to see how far Haydn has come, and also to point in the future, in the direction of where he's going, because this work really does that. It's a wonderful summarizing piece, but it also foreshadows much to come. It's a fascinating symphony, and what makes it so interesting to me is that it's one of the longest that Haydn ever wrote. If you were to do it with all of its repeats, which virtually no performance does, even like the period instrument ones, it would last between, close to 40 minutes. 35 to 40 minutes. The performance that I have on Naxos, from the Naxos Complete Edition, does not take second half repeats in the first movement and the slow movement, and it still runs to 28 and a bit minutes. So if you took the second half repeat in the slow movement, which would add 5 minutes, it's an 11-minute long slow movement without the second half repeat, which means it would be like 16 minutes with the repeat. That's a long movement. So that would get you up to like 33, 34 minutes. And the first movement is 8 minutes and something. Add another 4. You're getting close to 40 minutes, 35 plus. That is as long as virtually any symphony until you get to the late Romantic period. And some of the crazy extreme ones by Beethoven, like the Eroica. But the 35 to 40 minutes is as long as most Brahms symphonies or Dvorak symphonies or Tchaikovsky symphonies. That is the length of a major symphony. And in this symphony, number 42 of Haydn, we see that kind of expansiveness really for the very first time. And how Haydn does it is a wonderful topic for discussion. But more than that, I want to compare it to where we came from, to where Haydn started approximately a decade and a few years ago, because he began writing symphonies in the late 1750s, and this symphony was done around 1770. So figure a dozen years have passed since Haydn's first symphony, but by the time we get to number 42. That's a lot of work, and it's a lot of symphonies, but the style has changed so remarkably. And because we're taking these things one step at a time in increments, we tend to lose track of just what a distance Haydn is covering and what adventuresome maneuvers he has been embarking on to expand the language of classical music and enrich it emotionally, particularly. And the best way to do that, I think, is really very simple. We're going to compare the expositions of the first and second movements of Symphony number 1 with Symphony number 42. And boy, are you going to hear a difference. It's something you really only notice when you put them right next to each other. So I want to start with that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Symphony number 42 and listen to some big chunks of it and figure out what an extraordinary piece it really is. So first, let's listen to the exposition of Symphony number 1. Remember Symphony number 1? Well, here it is, just the exposition. charming, delightful, exciting, rhythmic, energetic. Now that exposition, the first part of the movement that just gives us the tunes, the main subjects that will be developed later, is about a minute and a few seconds long. I think it's a minute and 8 seconds exactly, or something like that. The exposition of Symphony No. 42, first movement, is almost exactly double. So how do you get to be double when you have two basic subjects? Well, there's only a couple ways to do it. You can write very long themes, which, is not really Haydn's style, or you can write lots of themes, which is more Haydn's style. You fill up the length with a variety of material, and that's exactly what Haydn does. And this is interesting because Haydn is known for being very concise, and he was a very concise composer, and he liked to work with his material very intensively. And so he was famous for writing subjects and movements which are known as monothematic, that is based on one idea. Well, no, that isn't what he always did, first of all. And we've talked a little bit about monothematicism and why it's a misnomer, and we'll be talking a lot more later. But here is a wonderful example of Haydn at his most expansive. In fact, the movement's tempo designation is moderato e maestoso, moderately and majestically, which is a very unusual designation for the period. And the music doesn't seem terribly slow at all. It really doesn't, but it does seem grand, and it does take its time. So here is the exposition of Symphony No. 42, first movement. Huge difference, isn't it? Not just in the amount of material, but in the way that it's played, in the harmonic richness of the music. The fact that it doesn't seem to go where you always think it's going to, whereas in the first symphony, the direction is far more predictable, I think, when you just listen to it. You may have noticed how at the end of the exposition of the first symphony, it had a couple really firm chords, then it goes back to the beginning. Here, it ends in an indeterminate way. You don't know what's going to happen next. Is it going to go back? Is it going to go forward? Haydn keeps us in suspense. So he's learning how to dramatize the music. So those are the two expositions, and I think we're going to leave it there for a moment. And now let's consider slow movements. Now, the slow movement of Symphony Number 1 is an andante. A lot of the early slow movements are, which is walking tempo. That is a moderate speed. It's written for strings only, often muted, not always, but that was Haydn's thing. And so it's a charming and delightful and sort of sunny and just relaxing little interlude. And here is the exposition, because it is in sonata form, like the first movement. That is two big halves with a development in the middle, sort of, kind of. Here is the exposition, the first half of the slow movement of Symphony Number 1. Like I said, charming, easy to listen to, easy, breezy, beautiful. Well, we're not going to go for the complete commercial there, but it's charming music. Not terribly deep emotionally, I would say, at that point, although Haydn would very quickly get there in these early symphonies, especially when he chooses a minor key for the slow movement. So that isn't something that you can take for granted. He always had that ability to write profoundly expressive music. But this case is just a nice, relaxing, middle type movement, right? So here is the 11-minute long, and barely 15-minute long, slow movement of Symphony Number 42. The exposition now is 3 times as long, because that one for Symphony Number 1 was about a minute. This one is more than 3 minutes. And it is exquisite. And you will hear Haydn very carefully using woodwind instruments. Now, they've joined the rest of the orchestra, and he uses them as a way to enrich the color of the music, to justify repetition. And it's the repetition that makes it so expansive. And he also, this is much slower. This movement is, let's see, what's this one? This is, it's marked andantino, a cantabile. Andantino is a little andante. That's a little slower and songful. Very, very, very expansive and long-breathed melodies and singing woodwinds when they repeat, and really, really distinctive melodies, beautiful melodies, a romantic melody, you might even call it, compared to what we heard in the first. So here is the slow movement, the exposition, 3 minutes of it, of Symphony Number 42's Andantino e Cantabile. What a difference, huh? Seriously, the whole universe of music seems to have opened up under Haydn's very assured guidance. It's a beautiful, beautiful movement. It really is. But it is a long movement, and it's not a surprise that most performances would leave out the second half repeat. Although I have to say, it's not dull in any way. It really works fine if you do it, which is not always the case with these movements. It really isn't. But Haydn usually arranges his music so that the repeats do not create dullness, as they often do, even in Mozart. They really do. You have to be careful when it comes to the repeats. So this is just a little example of how far we've come since Haydn's first symphony a dozen years previously. And he's already just done amazing things, I think you'll agree, with the language of music, and he's learned how to write in this expansive and breezy way. Now let's go back to the first movement and talk about the rest of the symphony for a bit. The first movement, like I said, is about 8 minutes long, and if you do it with the repeat, it's about 10, 12 minutes long. It's going to be a big, big movement. And the other way that Haydn is discovering how to write long is to have some fun with his developments. Haydn is one of the most developmental composers that have ever lived, even more than Beethoven. He's constantly manipulating his material. Now, in this particular symphony, because he had such a long exposition, he filled it with many different ideas, many different tunes and ideas, and it really is something that it sounds very, very fresh and very full of variety. This is exactly what Beethoven would do, by the way, in his Eroica Symphony. Remember I told you that in sonata movements there's basically two kinds of music. There's the themes in their individual key areas, and then there's motion music that gets us from one place to another. But that motion music can be thematic. It can be just as important as the main tunes. And here you find that Haydn puts a lot of different little ideas into the transitional material, so much so that you're not even really conscious of transitioning. You just hear one theme after another. It's a parade, a pageant of different ideas. And Beethoven took that concept, and that's exactly what he did in the Eroica Symphony, because some of the biggest tunes in the first movement actually occur in the transitional material. You may remember ya-da-dum, ba-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. That's the transitional material, but that's a big tune in the Eroica. And so it happens with Haydn. However, in the development, Haydn is extremely, concise with his material, very, very abstemious in what he chooses. In other words, the opening was jump, yum, 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 right? And that sort of, you might call it a chicken theme. He uses them sometimes when it goes yum, 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 like that. Well, that's really all the development. He's going to take a tiny little motive, the tiniest little motive from this huge exposition, and that's what he's going to develop, almost exclusively. Not entirely, but almost. But this development section is important because we've heard one of the things he does before, but I haven't talked about it. He uses what they call a false reprise. The false reprise is a wonderful little gizmo that Haydn started using about this time, a little bit before. It is a pretend recapitulation. In other words, he seems to go back to the beginning, but then the music veers off in another direction. And he does that in this development section twice. Now, the result of that is really marvelous because he's faking us out, first of all. We think, oh my God, we're just going to hear the beginning again. Then it goes somewhere else. And we're conscious of the fact that the music is developing, that things are happening, that it's going in new and dramatic directions. That's one thing that it does. And he does that, like I said, twice. And I'm going to indicate where it happens. So pay attention while you're watching this. I know that this has just like this thing in front of it, but I will indicate where the false reprises are so that you can hear how that opening keeps returning. But then the wonderful thing about it is when the recapitulation finally comes, when we're actually back home and he does repeat the opening of the symphony, first of all, we're not sure that's what he's doing. because we can't know that it's not going to go somewhere else. And second of all, because this is Haydn, he continues to develop the material, albeit with the intent of establishing the home key again, this feeling of stability, of returning back to where we started. But the music itself is going to be considerably different than it was when we first heard it. The feeling of being back is only gradually achieved as we get to the end of the movement. And so the entire piece seems like a continuous onward development of that initial idea, in spite of the fact that there's tons and tons of material and different themes and tunes and things in the exposition. We never get tired of hearing it, and we never cease to feel this onward motion, this continual evolution and drive behind the music, even though the tempo is quite moderate. So what I'm going to do now is I want to play the remainder of the first movement for you, the development and the recapitulation, and I will indicate those two fake reprises and where the recapitulation actually happens. And just listen to it. It's just, like typically with Haydn, it's unbelievably entertaining and beautiful, beautiful music, full of vigor and joy and invention. That's the thing, invention. It's like there's a newness and a freshness to this music that really is coming from Haydn's joy in being able to write in a more expansive style than he had been writing in before. So the symphony in its way is a landmark. So here is the rest of the first movement. stuff, isn't it? And did you notice how when the real recapitulation happened, Haydn managed to enrich the color with the use of the oboes and the wind section, and it's just gorgeous. Okay, so that's the first movement. Now, we've already heard the exposition of the second movement, so I'm not going to deal with that. The minuet is of an ample proportion, rather, in keeping with the scope of the symphony as a whole, but we don't have to listen to that either. It does have a delicious trio for strings only, which is really it has a little comic twist, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. You just listen to it and enjoy it. The finale, though, the finale. Here we have another milestone. This finale is really fascinating. It's a theme in variations. And it's a theme in variations, but it's a theme in variations in very quick tempo, which is unusual for themes and variations. Most variations begin rather moderately, and they may have quicker and slower variations as the tune gets varied. But you don't normally find one that this one is presto. Yes, scherzando e presto. That means joking, light joking, and fast all the way through it. It's only about 3.5 minutes long, and it has its own internal repeats, but you take all of them because the theme is in two parts, and both parts get repeated. And that's true of all the variations as well. So what we have is a theme, 4 variations, and then a coda based on the theme. Now, the variations do not stray very far from the theme. You can hear the theme in the variations. That isn't always the case with variations, and we'll talk about other kinds of them, when they arise. Haydn was an amazing variation writer, but to write a variation movement as a finale is very unusual. We've only heard it really once before so far. That was in the Horn Signal Symphony back in the 30s, where he used the variation idea as a way to show off this very large orchestra with 4 horns and woodwinds and all that stuff. And he does the same thing here. Each variation is a character piece. The first variation is for woodwinds only. And it is only in this variation that we learn that Haydn wanted 2 bassoons to be playing in this symphony, because that's the only place where he mentions them. And he puts a little note that, well, if you don't have 2 bassoons, you can use 2 cellos. But he wants bassoons. You've got to have bassoons. So what do they do for the rest of the symphony, you might wonder? Well, they would play along with the cellos, essentially. They would play the bass line, as much of it as they feel comfortable doing whenever they feel like it. I mean, that's how it worked in those days. But when Haydn really wants them, he indicates for them to play. And that tells us something else really quite significant, which is that the size of the orchestra that Haydn was working with, that we know about, the standard size, was very fluid. You can't say just because it looks like he only had like 3 violins and half a cello and tiny little wind section that that's what was either the ideal or what always played on the day. Because the symphonies are full of moments when other instruments pop up and you suddenly mention something. And we don't know, there were musicians around at Esterházy or wherever he was, because everybody played instruments in those days. And the more things you could do and the more instruments you could play, the more money you could make, and the more versatile you were, and the more valuable you were to the servants, to the staff of the Esterházy establishment. So there were lots of people who played things, and probably a lot of them were corralled into performing in these symphonies when they were necessary. But anyway, the first variation is for woodwinds alone. The second variation is for strings alone, and it's a perpetual motion. It's the theme in very, very quick notes. The third variation is a minor key variation, and it's much larger than the other ones. The theme is a very basic 8 bars plus 8 bars, each half repeated. Very standard and uncontroversial form of a theme. The most simple thing that you can be, because that, of course, means that you can do things more interestingly in the variations. And this minor key variation is quite long. It's like 30 some odd bars or something. It's much, much longer than the original theme. And it serves not just as the third variation, but also in a way as a kind of development section, a development of the motives that the theme consists of. And so this is where you'll really hear Haydn, the great variation writer, strutting his stuff, doing his thing with taking an idea and expanding it. Because everything about this symphony is expansion. It's making things bigger and longer and greater, putting greater breadth into it, and in so doing, enhancing the emotional expression, because this is in a minor key. So it's stern and it's turbulent, and that's the third variation. Now the fourth variation brings the whole ensemble back together, really for the first time, because you'll remember the first variation was only woodwinds, the second will be only strings. The third, the minor key one, does have a couple moments at the loud bits where the oboes and the horns pop in, but you don't really notice them as such. It's mostly strings. But now the whole orchestra is happy. The theme comes back. It's a very, very slight variation of the original theme, and it leads to a coda, which provides the happy wind-up of the whole symphony. Now, I will indicate, again, as you listen to this, where each variation occurs so that you can follow them easily and know, what to listen for. But that's Symphony Number 42, and here is the entire finale. You ready? Here it comes. very remarkable movement. Not long, but it seems bigger than it is. Why? Because of all of the internal repetition of each section, because of its regularity. That makes something sound somewhat bigger because of its very predictability, and also because of that big expansion of the minor key variation in the middle. It really is a remarkable symphony. And like I said, Haydn is always sort of treated or dismissed as somebody who wrote miniatures, who wrote on a very small scale. And most of the time, he wrote on a, let's just say, adequate scale. I wouldn't say he's small scale, because he packs a lot of punch into his music. But concision is not a quality, I think, that should ever be used as a negative accusation against a composer, especially somebody like Haydn. Really, it's just terrible that anybody would say such a thing. But what this symphony shows is that breadth is always around the corner with Haydn, and he will take advantage of this ability to expand and to write large, and his ability to write incredibly concisely in the symphonies to come. The things that he does in this symphony, the use of variations, is going to be a hallmark of his symphonies going forward. The idea of the fake reprise, the fake recapitulation, it's in French, a fausse reprise, if you want to call it that, but as something as a way to expand the development section and to keep you guessing, to increase the sense of drama and suspense in his music. That's going to become a constant as we move forward. So this symphony, like I said, it looks forward and it looks back. And I hope this opportunity to take a little pause and see how far we've come will energize you to move us forward on the remainder of the Haydn Symphony Crusade, because we're almost halfway there. Almost, but we're getting there. We're really getting there. And things are just getting more and more exciting as we go. I mean, the thrills are just beginning. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.